All right, hello everybody, and welcome back to another tier list from the Rubber Match. This is my fifth one that I'm doing as part of this channel, and also the second one revolving around baseball. And with the MLB postseason in full swing, I figured it'd be a perfect time to go through and look at all of the World Series champions over the years and rank them basically on which teams were the best of the best team of each season. So within doing this, I do want to say that I am still going to mostly emphasize their playoff run and their roster, but I also am still going to consider the regular season performance of these teams when going through with it. So do want to set that, kind of standard before I jump into this, that obviously you have some teams here, namely the '06 Cardinals standing out the most of these, that did not have the best regular seasons, but of course found a way to put it together in the playoffs. So I do want to consider the roster, the opponents, the path there, all of those things when taking a look at this tier list. So we're going to get started there. These are all of the ones of the 21st century, so therefore we start off with the 2000 New York Yankees. This was the final of the four teams to win in 5 years for the Yankees starting in 1996. And strangely enough, this team was, I think, on paper, the worst of those teams. 87 wins in the regular season, which is certainly well below what you typically see from a World Series champion. And that's, of course, just 2 years after the Yankees won 114 games and won the World Series, one of the greatest teams of all time. This was a team that I feel like won on virtue of grit and experience, and that showed in every round of this postseason. They went through both AL West teams in order to get to the World Series. It's both AL West teams that made the playoffs, that is, starting with the Oakland Athletics in a very competitive ALDS that went 5 games, and then taking down the Seattle Mariners that were led by Edgar Martinez and Alex Rodriguez in 6 games, then winning the Subway Series against the New York Mets in just 5 games. This is a team that obviously has plenty of insane generational talent on it, despite its record. But I do think that this isn't one of the best Yankees teams to have won it all. I think that the run is very impressive, and getting through Seattle in particular is really a juggernaut in this given season. But I don't think that the league as a whole was the most competitive that it's been in some of these seasons that we've seen in the years since. I think most notably the 2000 Mets, while very much so a good team that had a very good solid rotation. You had two lefties headlining that with Al Leiter and Mike Hampton. Of course, Mike Piazza in his prime at that time. But I don't think that it was among, the most challenging of World Series opponents that we've seen of some of these teams that did go on to win it all. So I think that this was a good team, a good World Series champion overall. I'm not putting it in the same echelon as I think some of the greatest teams that we've seen over the past 25 years, but certainly better than the 87 wins would lead you to believe. Coming up next, we have the 2001 World Series champions in the Arizona Diamondbacks. I mean, I would say easy to forget, but it really isn't, because it's one of the most notable moments in baseball history. But of course, the Yankees were just 3 outs away. They had the lead in the ninth inning from winning yet again in 2001. That would have made it, 5 in 6 years as far as winning the World Series. But the Diamondbacks, with an incredible comeback in Game 7, stopped that from happening. This was just a remarkably complete team through and through. I don't know if it's one of the greatest teams of all time. I don't know if I'd say that, but certainly one of the best playoff pitching duos, if not the best playoff pitching duo of all time, in Randy Johnson and Curt Schilling. Certainly a huge reason behind the success of this team. But you also had Luis Gonzalez, who finished third in MVP voting this season, hit 57 home runs. This team had plenty going on. You had Tony Womack with plenty of speed at the top of the lineup. Mark Grace with his last really good regular season in the major leagues. So this was overall just a really complete team, and it's crazy that it was just the fourth year in the Arizona Diamondbacks' existence, especially after they had already won 100 games going back in 1999, just their second year in play. But this team was just really, really good. I mean, they got through a Cardinals team that, had Mark McGwire in its last year, also had a really solid rotation in 5 games in the NLDS, handled the perennial contender Braves in the NLCS in just 5 games, and of course, one of the greatest World Series of all time to close it out. Put them in the great tier. This was, I think, still stands out as one of the better teams over the years. Next up, we have the 2002 Anaheim Angels. They had really a memorable run through the postseason. I think the thing that I remember most about this team, and I think it also applies to at least one other team that we'll talk about later on in this tier list, is that this is a team with really great talent through and through on the pitching staff, in the lineup, but everything clicked in the same year. Everybody had the year that they needed to have at the same time. And that really contributed to the Angels being the 99 win juggernaut that they were. But it is also worth noting that they won 99 games. They did not win their division. This was, of course, the year that the Oakland A's won 20 games in a row, won 103 games on the season. They ended up losing in the ALDS to the Minnesota Twins. The Angels, on the other hand, they upset the Yankees, who were experienced, coming off of going to the World Series in 98, 99, 2000, 2001, looking for their fifth straight pennant. They stopped them from that in 4 games. The Angels then handled the Twins quite well without home field advantage in the ALCS. They won that series in 5, and then one of the greatest World Series of the 21st century. I think one that gets forgotten because it came in the shadows of 2001, which is universally remembered as one of the best. But let's not sleep on 2002. The Angels with an incredible 5-0 comeback in Game 6. This was, of course, the best of Barry Bonds that I feel like we'll ever see. Some absolutely gargantuan home runs in that series. So the Angels, they had quite the juggernaut to get through. I mean, maybe the Twins weren't the scariest ALCS opponent, but when you look at what they had to battle through in the first round and then in the World Series as well, a Giants team that had arguably the greatest hitter of all time at its peak, and then also certainly a really good pitching staff as well. I think with Bonds at his best in 2002 in this era, really made it a great World Series and one that was very impressive for the Angels to come through and win. I think through and through, whether it's, Troy Percival being one of the better closers in this era, coming through and delivering throughout the postseason. A rookie John Lackey delivering in the World Series. Just a really solid lineup through and through of guys like Tim Salmon, Garrett Anderson, Darren Erstad, David Eckstein. Just a really fun, solid team. Also going to put this in the great tier. I think below the Diamondbacks, but not by too much, and I would take them over the 2000 Yankees. Next up, we have the 03 Marlins, the second World Series run for the Florida Marlins. This was a crazy team, a team that is, even as a Cubs fan, that of course broke my heart as a kid. I think just such a fun team to look back on, that had so much talent, and I think just really had all of the right ingredients that you need to win a championship. That may not stand out as the flashiest or the best in a regular season 162 game layout, but when you're talking about being the best team over a month of baseball, this Marlins team had all of the tools. And of course, Josh Beckett really turned into the postseason star that he ended up being known as later on in his career in this series. Of course, closed out the World Series with that complete game in New York. But I think you're also just looking at how complete this lineup was. I mean, Juan Pierre, one of the best table setters of the era. You had a rookie Miguel Cabrera. You had Pudge Rodriguez in his prime. Derek Lee really starting to get going in his career. Mike Lowell, of course, one of the best defensive third basemen who could also really swing the bat and give you plenty of power. This team was scary to face through and through. I feel like there was not really a discernible weakness that you could point to on this team, and I think that's why they were able to move their way through teams that I feel like most people thought were better than them. And I mean, at first, it was the Barry Bonds-led Giants that they got through in 4 games. Even though they had a better record than the Cubs in the regular season, the Cubs had home field advantage because they were a division champion, and the Marlins were able to get through that Kerry Wood, Mark Pryor juggernaut in the rotation, and a lineup that still had plenty of slug as well. And then after that, a Yankees team that was kind of reinvigorated after 2002. Of course, this, you have to remember, is Hideki Matsui's rookie year. Just another piece in that lineup that makes it even the more tougher to get through. And the Marlins just weathered every storm through the way. This is just a quintessential playoff champion, playoff winning team. I'll put this actually above the Diamondbacks, even in the great tier. That was an excellent, I think, underrated team in the grand scheme of things. But one team that I don't think you can call underrated is the curse breaking 2004 Boston Red Sox. Of course, arguably the most notable, or at least second most notable team on this list. Swept the Angels in the ALDS, had the 7-game ALCS comeback against the New York Yankees. Of course, trailed 3 games to nothing in that series, trailed in the bottom of the ninth of game 4 in that series, trailed late in game 5 of that series, came back, and to this day is the only 3-0 comeback in MLB postseason history. Oh, yeah, and then they swept a 105 win St. Louis Cardinals team that had 3 of the top 5 MVP finishers in the National League in Scott Rowland, Albert Pujols, and Jim Edmonds. So you have 2 Hall of Famers right there, and another guy who is Hall of Very Good for sure, and a really, really solid all throughout Cardinals team that season that had added Larry Walker at the trade deadline as well. But none of that mattered for a Red Sox team that was remarkably complete, had an insane rotation that, of course, Pedro Martinez and Kurt Schilling, 2 of the better postseason pitchers of all time, factored into that rotation. And, I don't need to go through the names in the lineup. You already know them all. But this team absolutely was incredible. Of course, this was a postseason that turned Big Papi into the postseason legend that he was known for and became a Hall of Famer for. Manny Ramirez with plenty of iconic moments in this postseason as well, and of course, just an unbelievable comeback of resiliency for this team. Unbelievable show of resiliency by this team, I should say, within the postseason, especially in the ALCS, and then just rolling through to steamroll the Cardinals, who were unbelievable. So they are going to go in my top tier. Let's not forget, they were a 98 win team in the regular season, too. It's not like this completely came out of nowhere, even though they were a wild card team behind the Yankees. So remarkable run there from the Red Sox. Speaking of remarkable runs, if we're just going to be considering the playoff run itself, then I think the title would have to go to the 2005 Chicago White Sox, who lost just once in the postseason. They swept the defending champion Red Sox, who, by the way, still won 95 games in 2005, emphatically swept them out of the ALDS, moved on and got past the Los Angeles Angels in the ALCS after losing game 1 at home. They won 4 straight, and that was a series that featured 3 complete games from the White Sox starting pitching staff. Absolutely unheard of. And then they go through and they sweep the Houston Astros, who had finally broken through to make it to a World Series. This team was absolutely sensational. I don't think that they stand out as one of the greatest of all time. They won 99 games, certainly really impressive in that regard. But I think, like the 0-2 Angels, this was a team that was just firing on all cylinders at the absolute right time. And I think one of the scariest playoff rotations, when you consider that all of these guys were pretty much in their peak, when you're looking at staring down Mark Burley and John Garland and Jose Contreras. And then, of course, this was the late Bobby Jenks' rookie season, where he emerged as an incredible closer for this 05 White Sox team. And then in the lineup, just a lot of guys that got hits when they needed to. Scott Podsednik and White Sox icon Paul Konerko, both with multiple big moments throughout the postseason. Juan Uribe, who was known as a clutch playoff performer throughout his career, heavily factored in, and of course made an incredible defensive play to close out the series. This was a great team. I think it's on par to me with the Angels. I don't think that the path there was the scariest. I don't view the 05 Angels or 05 Astros as some of the greatest teams ever. I think, honestly, their most impressive playoff showing was steamrolling the defending champion Red Sox in the first round. But with that said, this is just what it looks like when everybody has it going at the same time. Really an incredible run, and because of the only one loss, the 11-1 postseason record, going to put them above the Angels there in the great tier. Coming up next, we have the 2006 St. Louis Cardinals. This is probably the toughest one to rank on here. This team won 83 baseball games, and somehow that was good enough to win the National League Central. And I think it's important to look back at this weird mid 2000s era, specifically 2006 and 2007. The National League was at an unprecedented point of weakness. And I think it really, '06, the Mets were really good in the regular season. That kind of hid the problem. But in 2007, the Arizona Diamondbacks won 90 games, and they were the best team in the National League. So I think across the senior circuit, there was a lot of feeling that they were not catching up to the American League, which had so many fire-powered offenses at this point. It seemed like they were unbeatable against the National League in pretty much every context. But this Cardinals team proved it wrong, and I think even though they only won 83 games in a pretty lackluster division, I think the thing that you have to remember about this team is that it had one of the greatest hitters of all time at his peak, and Albert Pujols. And I think when that's the situation, it's really hard to count a team out. And of course, this was Yadier Molina really coming to his own as a playoff performer. Adam Wainwright at this point was the team's closer, and still just so much talent on this team. I mean, Scott Rowland's still right around his prime, playing a big role on this club. But I think the biggest part of this is that it was easy to overlook the Cardinals as an 83 win ball club, especially in the NLCS, where they faced a much better Mets roster that had a stacked rotation and a really good lineup. I mean, that was probably the best that you'll see out of Carlos Beltran's career, what we saw out of him that season with the Mets. But it just didn't matter. I mean, there were so many clutch performances from the Cardinals, and of course, coming through and neutralizing the crazy momentum swing of Game 7, that incredible home run robbing catch from Endy Chavez, and then Yadier Molina in the top of the ninth inning hits a 2-run home run to win the series eventually for the Cardinals. They got past a real juggernaut of a team with that Mets team, even though, yeah, you had kind of a softball in the first round with the Padres, who I believe only won 82 games to win their division. And then the World Series, they pretty handily got past the Detroit Tigers in 5 games, who had a very nice roster, and I think it was a great story to see the Tigers make it that far after losing a then record-setting 119 games just 3 years earlier. But this Cardinals team should not be disrespected for the 83 wins as much as I would like to disrespect them as a Cubs fan. They were, I don't think you can just say they won by default or how did they win. They won because they had one of the greatest hitters of all time, and they had a roster full of dudes who knew how to play in the playoffs. I'd actually even put this above the 2000 Yankees, because as much as a juggernaut of the as the 2000 Mariners were, I really think the '06 Mets, who were far and away the best team in the National League that year in the regular season, I think being able to beat them without home field advantage, really an incredible showing. Next up, we have the 2007 Boston Red Sox, a fun 96 win team that dominated a lot of the American League throughout the year, dominated the Angels in the ALDS with a sweep, which seemed to be customary for the Red Sox after getting through them in 2004, and they would get through them again in 2008, the following season. But then after that, they ran into a real challenge with the then Cleveland Indians. They fall behind 3 games to 1 in that series against a team that I think has forgotten how good they were. Of course, you had CC Sabathia in his final full season in Cleveland at the front of that rotation, but I mean, really, a very, very good lineup on that Cleveland team as well. Of course, that was also Kenny Lofton's final season. He was still performing as a table setter, for that Cleveland team. But a lot of young talent, a young Asdrubal Cabrera, a young Johnny Peralta, Casey Blake at his best for that Cleveland team. And you also can't forget Travis Hafner and Grady Sizemore still really slugging for Cleveland at that time. They also won 96 games. But that ended up being an incredible comeback for the Red Sox. They were able to neutralize Sabathia in a Game 5 in Cleveland and then win both games at home as they returned with home field advantage to move on to the World Series, where they steamrolled the Colorado Rockies 4 games to 0. And that is arguably maybe the most boring World Series itself of the 21st century. Just not really a whole lot going on in that one. You had a bit of a Rockies comeback in Game 3 that was a slugfest. Game 2 was close. And Game 4 was close as well, but I just feel like none of them really stood out as a classic game. The Rockies certainly did not seem to be the team to pose, the most threatening challenge to the Boston Red Sox this year. So while they were a great regular season team and they certainly had an incredible comeback against an underrated Cleveland team, they don't really stand out to me as much as the '04 team does. Despite, certainly had a very good lineup and a pitching staff that was, I wouldn't say just as good, but, still had Beckett, still had Schilling, Daisuke Matsuzaka came in there. Um, John Lester, of course, with an incredible performance in Game 4 of that year's World Series, but just doesn't quite stand out, especially on the run through the postseason in the way that the 2004 Red Sox do. Coming up next, though, we have the 2008 Philadelphia Phillies. This was their first title since 1980. They got through the Tampa Bay Rays in the World Series 4-1 this year, and that was the same score that they were able to get past the Los Angeles Dodgers in the NLCS. This was a team that had done really well throughout the season. They won the NL East. They also had gotten past the Milwaukee Brewers 3-1 in the NLDS, the first round of the playoffs, which was certainly big for them to win that playoff series. This was a team that had an incredible comeback in 2007 and then won the division over the New York Mets, who collapsed at the end of the year. But then they got swept by the Colorado Rockies in the NLDS despite having home field advantage. This year, they neutralized the strength that the Brewers had with an unreal run from CC Sabathia through the second half of the season after he was acquired at the trade deadline. And the Phillies only lost one game in each postseason series. This was, I think, a remarkably complete team. I also think perhaps a bit underrated in the grand scheme of things when looking at World Series championships. I mean, this was Chase Utley, Jimmy Rollins, and Brian Howard at their absolute prime. Cole Hamels came through and certainly established himself as one of the best postseason pitchers of the era in this year. This is a team that I think, like the Diamondbacks, like the Marlins, you just don't really see a discernible weakness on it, and that's certainly why they were able to really cruise through the postseason. I'll put them at the top of the great tier. Next up, we have the championship that felt very purchased, and I think in hindsight it still kind of was, but that doesn't mean that this wasn't an absolutely unreal team in the 2009 New York Yankees. They had to face the Phillies in an attempt to defend their World Series title. They made it back to the World Series, but could not do much against this Yankees team that, after missing the playoffs in 2008, and I think it's worth noting, that was a huge deal, missing the playoffs for the Yankees in 2008. This team had not missed the playoffs since 1993. You had the strike in 94, the start of division series play. They hadn't missed the playoffs since. They had only not won the division 3 times in that span as well, from 1995 to 2007. And then they miss out in the playoffs. The Rays and the Red Sox, both better than them in the American League East. So what did the Yankees do? They signed Mark Teixeira, they signed CC Sabathia, and they signed AJ Burnett. And then it just so happens to coincide with Derek Jeter having an incredible season later on in his career. Alex Rodriguez, of course, still maybe not quite at his peak, but still close enough to his peak to still be an incredible hitter and one to be very scared of in this Yankees lineup. And then that's just adding Sabathia and Burnett to a rotation that already includes a guy like Andy Pettitte, one of the best postseason pitchers ever. Of course, Mariano Rivera still there to shut the door in the ninth. This team, certainly had its challenges in the ALCS and World Series. They swept the Minnesota Twins in the ALDS without much difficulty, but the Rangers, or I shouldn't say Rangers, I'm thinking of the ALCS the year after, my bad, a different AL West team. The Los Angeles Angels, who were in the ALCS that year, did give the Yankees a little bit of a fit. You had a rain out in that series. That series ended up going 6 games. And then the Phillies also took the Yankees to 6 games, but you got to give the Yankees a lot of credit. The Phillies were able to split those first 2 games in New York, and the Yankees were essentially unfazed. It gave them one last chance to hit Pedro Martinez in the playoffs, who retired after this season was over. This team was just remarkably complete, it felt like they were inevitable the entire season. This is one of those teams that, unfortunately, as a Yankees hater, you just kind of got to put in the top tier. They really were incredible and one of the best World Series champions of the 21st century. Next, we have the first of three San Francisco Giant World Series championships. That is the one in 2010. This was a Giants team that felt like it was on the cusp of really doing something great. They always had the pitching, they had the cavernous ballpark to play into their advantage with that, but they never really had the lineup to get it through. And this was perhaps that first year where they really did have a lineup that, while not the most imposing, had plenty of guys that got hits when they needed to. Most namely Buster Posey, who was National League Rookie of the Year this year, and then of course Aubrey Huff, who had, despite being an awful person, had a really solid year in 2010 and had finished seventh in MVP voting. Can't forget the role that Pablo Sandoval played on these teams as well. And this was, of course, the emergence of a 20-year-old Madison Bumgarner really being a stud in the playoffs at that young age, pitching an absolute gem in the World Series. I believe he was actually 21 by the time the World Series had started, but just the beginning of the postseason legend of Bumgarner as well. As far as the gauntlet that this Giants team had to get through, I don't think that it was particularly crazy or memorable, but also not one to completely sneeze over. Most notably, what they faced in the NLCS. They got past the Atlanta Braves, who would return to the playoffs in 4 games in the NLDS, and in the NLCS had to handle the two-time defending NL champion Phillies, who were heavily favored in this series to beat a Giants team that was inexperienced in comparison, but this was also a club that had Tim Lincecum still near his prime. Matt Cain was still pitching very well. And Barry Zito, despite being quite inconsistent throughout the regular season in his Giants tenures, was massive in the playoffs. Both in this run and in the following Giants run as well. So really a great showing for the San Francisco Giants throughout the playoffs. Got through the Phillies in 6 games and then handled the Rangers in 5 games, who had added Cliff Lee at the trade deadline. I think certainly had a stronger lineup than the Giants, but it just didn't matter. San Francisco had one of the most complete pitching staffs that you're going to find in a postseason. Brian Wilson shutting the door for this team in the ninth inning as well, right around the peak of his career. This was a really good team. I mean, as much as it feels like, they weren't the best team in 2010, I think that there are a lot of people thinking the Yankees were going to run it back. The Rangers were, of course, it had one of the best lineups in baseball. The Phillies appeared more than capable to come through and win the World Series again. But this Giants team just had an unbelievable amount of grit, and this got them the experience that really paved the way for them to win 2 more titles in the coming years after that. So I'll put them in the good. I don't mean to disrespect this Giants team, but I think that is an accurate placement considering the NLDS World Series opponents. Rangers are really good offensively, but I don't feel like that pitching staff really matched up at all with San Francisco outside of Cliff Lee. So I think that's where I have them. And I honestly don't know if I'm going to put anybody in these tiers. I think that it's kind of insulting to say that a team won by default, but we'll get there as we move on. Next up, we have the 2011 St. Louis Cardinals. Of course, one of the most incredible comebacks in MLB postseason history, down to their final strike twice in Game 6 of the World Series that year against the Rangers, who had won the American League for a second straight year. The Cardinals were able to come back twice in that situation, trailing 2 runs, both in the ninth inning and then again in extras, and were able to find a way to tie the game and then end up winning the game, of course, on that iconic David Freese walk-off shot. But I think the other thing you have to consider with this Cardinals team is that the magic came long before that home run by David Freese. This was a team that came back big on the Atlanta Braves to earn the National League wildcard spot. They were trailing by 7 to the Braves in September. It was a combined Cardinals rally and Braves collapse that allowed St. Louis to get into the playoffs. And then once they did, they easily, I shouldn't say easily, that is insulting and I'm mixing up my words here, but they were able to get through the 101 win Philadelphia Phillies, who were heavily favored. And I also think it's worth noting that that Phillies team was the last great Phillies team of this era, and it kind of symbolically ended with Ryan Howard tearing his Achilles, running to first on the series ending ground out there. But after upsetting the Phillies in 5 games, they then went on to face the division rival Brewers in the NLCS, who had home field advantage. And the Cardinals, using a lot of that postseason experience and grit that they had on that roster, were able to get through that series. And then, of course, an incredible 7 game World Series that featured an unreal performance from Albert Pujols on the road, to, of course, a big role in this series for the Cardinals. But we also can't forget, a guy like Lance Berkman, who appeared to be on the back end of his career, putting up an incredible season and postseason for the Cardinals in 2011. This team may not stand out by its regular season feats, but still a really good roster and truly one of the most impressive postseason runs that you're going to come across. So I'm going to put them up here in the great tier. Next, we have the 2012 Giants. This is a team that also certainly had to fight through, quite a battle to get through where they needed to be to win the World Series, coming through and facing the Cincinnati Reds in the National League Division Series. This was a team that had won their division, but it seemed that the postseason was coming to a quick end. They lost both games to the Reds at San Francisco. This was a year where the LDS took on the unconventional 2-3 format, so they had to finish the series in Cincinnati against this 97-win Reds team that had been very good all year, and they came back from the 2-0 deficit. And of course, that included a Buster Posey grand slam in Game 5 in Cincinnati. And as if that wasn't enough terror to cause to the NL Central, they moved on to face the St. Louis Cardinals in the NLCS, where they overcame a 3-1 deficit to win 3 in a row and win that series in a decisive 7th game in front of the crowd in San Francisco. And then faced the Tigers team that appeared like it had everything you needed to win a World Series, besides perhaps a bit of a weaker bullpen, but certainly a very formidable lineup in a really good rotation headlined by Justin Verlander and Max Scherzer. And it just didn't matter. The Giants absolutely steamrolled the Tigers in the World Series in a sweep after getting through 2 very impressive rounds in the National League. And I think those LDS and LCS runs among the most impressive of the 21st century. The World Series opponent, however, I feel like, maybe a bit perhaps of a letdown. Even though this, I feel like going in, everybody expected it to be a really competitive and good series, but the Tigers just could not figure out the San Francisco pitching staff this season. And of course, more gems for Madison Bumgarner throughout the playoffs. This team is going to go up in the great tier. I'll put them right next to the Cardinals in that regard. 2013, we have the Boston Red Sox. This is a team that just the year before had finished in last place and had only won 69 games. They hired John Farrell as their manager, rally back, strengthen up the roster a little bit. And this team was tied for the best in baseball in the regular season with 97 wins. And they were able to get through the playoffs, I would say, in a relatively normal kind of pace. Beat the Rays 3-1 in the ALDS. And then, of course, they were on the precipice of a sweep in that series and ended up allowing a game-tying home run in Game 3 of that series, and the Rays ended up walking off to extend that. And then it really looked like they were in trouble in the ALCS against the Detroit Tigers. I mean, this was a team that almost got no hit in the first game of that series. And then in Game 2, they're trailing 5-1 in the bottom of the 8th inning, almost down to go 2-0 and having to head back to Detroit. Enter David Ortiz with one of the most clutch home runs in postseason history, a game-tying grand slam that really paved the way for this to be a year of destiny for the Red Sox. They would win that series against the Tigers in 6 games. They would only drop one of those 3 games in Detroit, and then went on to win the World Series in 6 games as well, coming back from a 2-1 deficit to the fellow 97-win St. Louis Cardinals, who I think were a really, really strong team that season, specifically with hitting and runners in scoring position. And the Red Sox, with just a really solid rotation headlined by John Lester and John Lackey, 2 guys that have really performed well throughout the playoffs in their career. This is a team that, they were on top of the league the entire season. They had a few troubles here in the postseason, but they really proved to be the best team in baseball throughout the year. And while they perhaps didn't feel as inevitable as the '09 Yankees, they still certainly were a team that lived up to their reputation as the best throughout the entire season. So I'll put them right there on top of the great tier. And now, with another 10 world champions to go, coming up next, we have the 2014 Giants, the third of the three early 2010s Giants world champions. This team was a wild card team. They were not able to beat the Dodgers out for the division title. They had to fight for their playoff lives in a wild card game in a ruckus PNC Park against the Pirates, who had won that wild card game in Pittsburgh just a year prior. The Giants shut them out 8-0, thanks to, guess who, Madison Bumgarner, with a complete game shutout in that game. They moved on to the National League Division Series from there and took down the Washington Nationals, who were a really solid team throughout the regular season. I believe expected by many to perhaps win the National League. Are able to get through them in 4 games, with the one game that they lost actually being Game 3 at home. And then faced the St. Louis Cardinals in the NLCS for a second time in 3 years. This also marked the 4th straight NLCS appearance by the Cardinals. And unlike 2012, the Giants never really gave them a chance to get ahead. The Giants had a statement Game 1 win in St. Louis in the series, and even though they lost a dramatic Game 2 in walk-off fashion, they were able to win all 3 games at home, with Travis Ishikawa being the hero in Game 5 with a walk-off home run off of Michael Wacha to bring the Giants back to the World Series, in a series that ended up being one of the best World Series of the 21st century. You had 2 wildcard teams that both had to win a single game at the end of September, or in the Giants' case, beginning of October, to maintain their playoff lives and hopes. And it ended up being an incredible series between the Giants and the Kansas City Royals. This ended up going to a 7th game, and of course, Madison Bumgarner, with one of the more iconic postseason performances in recent memory, coming through and pitching, I believe, the last 4+ innings of that game, shutting down the Royals, not giving up anything besides an Alex Gordon single in the 9th that ended up turning into a basically triple, a 2-base error charged on that put the Royals 90 feet away from tying the game with 2 outs in the 9th inning. You can't make for a more dramatic ending, and the Giants were able to close that one out and win in 7 games. So really a fantastic showing throughout the entire playoffs for a Giants team that I think clearly did not have the best roster all season long. It certainly looked like they did early on in 2014, and then kind of scuffled throughout much of the second half of the season. But I think they really proved that they had that championship DNA from 2010 and 2012. And I kind of view this team on a similar lens that I view these other two, the 2000 Yankees and the '06 Cardinals. Just teams that had too much talent, for you to sleep on them given what their record was, and too much experience, to completely write them off as being below teams that had a better record than them in the regular season. Next up, we have the Kansas City Royals of 2015. This is a very fun World Series champion for me. A team that just proved small ball is sometimes what wins titles, and I think I loved how it really proved, the team's mantra was proven to itself and a national audience in Game 5 of that year's World Series, where it was just putting the ball in play in the 9th inning against Matt Harvey and eventually Yuri's Familia to tie the game and then end up winning that decisive game in extra innings. But this Royals team had perhaps its most notable challenge in the ALDS against an upstart Houston Astros team that had made it to the postseason for the first time with the Jose Altuve, George Springer, Carlos Correa core. And the Astros had a 2-1 lead, or building a 4-run lead at home in Game 4 of that series, and the Royals, with an absolutely thunderous comeback late in that game, they end up heading back to Kansas City, and they closed out that series in 5 games, and then faced the Toronto Blue Jays team that, it certainly surprised a lot of people throughout the regular season and emerging as one of the better teams in the AL. A lot of power on that team with Josh Donaldson, Jose Bautista, Edwin Encarnacion, and it just didn't matter for this Kansas City Royals team. And then they ended up handling the Mets, who had an incredible rotation in 5 games in the World Series. And I think one thing that stands out to me about this Royals team, they made a move at the deadline that made the difference, and that was adding Johnny Cueto to this team. He had been an incredible starter the last few years for Cincinnati. He gets added into this rotation, rewards him by pitching an absolute gem in the World Series, was a very steady force for them throughout the playoffs, and I think a big reason why this team, that 95 wins, was steady throughout the season. They're a memorable champion, and I think it's easy to see how they were able to have what it took to be able to win the World Series. I'll put them at the top of the good tier for them. Next up, we have the 2016 Chicago Cubs. This is a team that I would say goes into the category of the '09 Yankees, a feeling inevitable, as they won 103 games and were the best team in baseball all year. But I can't quite say that because this team also was in the midst of a 108-year championship drought, and we're battling through that, and certainly had plenty to get through in that regard. The Cubs, despite their incredible record, really had quite the postseason gauntlet to get through. They had to face a Giants team looking for yet another even year World Series title. Cubs were able to get through that series in 4 games. And then the NL West champion LA Dodgers, who had just gutted out a close NLDS with the Washington Nationals, who had home field advantage and who many people thought were a better team than the Dodgers that season. But the Dodgers, certainly with plenty of grit and a lineup that had a lot going for it at the time. This is still when Adrian Gonzalez was one of the best first basemen in the National League and all of baseball. But the Cubs were able to come back from a 2-1 deficit in that series. They dropped games 2 and 3 and ended up winning 3 in a row to win their first pennant since 1945. And of course, I could go on and on about the 2016 World Series against Cleveland and how it is arguably the greatest World Series of all time. Cubs coming back from a 3-1 deficit in that series. So certainly were thrown everything by Cleveland, but were able to make their way back from it. A huge Game 5 victory at home. We're trailing 1-0 and then end up winning a low-scoring 3-2 affair. And then the energy that traveled with the Cubs back to Cleveland as they were able to win both games 6 and 7, I think heavily on virtue of how great this rotation was. I mean, you're looking at John Lester, Jake Arrieta, Kyle Hendricks, and John Lackey. I mean, really an incredible group of starters to have in the playoffs, and that is, of course, on top of having Chris Bryant being the NL MVP that season, Anthony Rizzo finishing 4th in MVP voting. You had the best season that you were ever going to get out of Addison Russell. Javier Baez, an incredible role player. Same can be said for Ben Zobrist. You had the emergence of Wilson Contreras as a rookie. I think across the board, this team certainly had it all. And like the 2015 Royals, they made a move at the deadline that made a difference. I don't think this team wins it all without having Aroldis Chapman as your closer, who had a heroic performance in Game 5 of that year's World Series. Just not really a discernible weakness on the team, and I think right on par with those '09 Yankees in that regard. After that, we had the 2017 Astros. After a 1-year absence in the postseason, they came back with a vengeance. They were able to take care of the Boston Red Sox in 4 games in the ALDS. The home team in the ALCS against the New York Yankees won every game. Fortunately for the Astros, that benefited them as they had home field advantage, and they were able to come back from that 3-2 deficit to win the series in 7 games. And then they were faced with another 7-game series against the Los Angeles Dodgers, who had been the best team in baseball all year. And this produced some of the better games in recent memory, namely Game 5, but also Game 2 of this series was really incredible and memorable, just from a neutral fan's perspective. Of course, this championship has layers to it because it was, of course, discovered a few years later that there was a lot of sign stealing going on with this team and potentially also the team the year after leading up into the playoffs. So certainly some blatant cheating behind what made this possible. But I think at the same time, um, this team was really good on paper throughout the year. I think it was expected that they were going to be an incredible team come the playoffs. But I do think that you have to consider that they were putting themselves at an advantage that other teams are not aware of. And I understand that like sign stealing is a part of a game, to a degree, and we don't really deal with that anymore because of PitchCom. But to the extent that the Astros had a system for getting that advantage at home was really unprecedented, and I do think deserves more scrutiny in terms of the lens of what cheating is considered than a player doing performance enhancing drugs, which yes may turn a fly ball into a home run every now and then, but if you're not a good contact hitter, not somebody that's well conditioned or not somebody that's mentally prepared to play in the postseason, those things don't make a difference. And I think if you look back on the players that did test positive for performance enhancing drugs over the years, the vast majority of them are no name players. And, that's because they're trying to do what they can to stay in the league. But I think that the advantage that the Astros were able to give themselves in 2017 throughout the playoffs and throughout the regular season really exceeds what that advantage may be for performance enhancing drugs, to where it's a team wide advantage and what pitch is coming. Like that, it's hard to overstate how much of a difference that could make. And of course, still quite incredible that they were able to face such a significant challenge. But I mean, when you look at an ALCS where the Astros lost all three games that were played in New York, it does make you scratch your head a little bit. So I think in that regard, I'm not going to, I will put them in this tier. I know I said I may not put anybody in that tier, but I think it may not be in the best interest to compare a team that, has this major cloud surrounding how they won the World Series with teams that essentially do not. And I also think it's worth noting that there were lesser known but existing controversies with the Boston Red Sox, the 108 win team that won the World Series the following year. Of course, this wasn't quite to the extent of the Houston Astros and didn't receive, anywhere near the extent of notoriety. I think it does kind of prove that throughout major leagues, especially at this time, that there was a conceded effort by a lot of organizations to find a way to get ahead and maybe get an advantage that others were not so aware of. But I think even with that said, the 2018 Red Sox were absolutely ridiculous. I mean, 108 wins in the regular season, an absolutely unreal outfield and designated hitter core with Mookie Betts, Jackie Bradley Jr., Andrew Benintendi, and JD Martinez, who had an insane season offensively. But if we're talking about insane offensive seasons, one of the best ones in recent memory this year by Mookie Betts as well. This season was also memorable for David Price finally breaking that big postseason struggle streak that he was on. Chris Sale closing out the World Series for this Red Sox team. Once again, a team that just didn't really feel like it had a discernible weakness, yet Craig Kimbrell still near his peak as a closer for this club, performing quite well throughout the playoffs. This was, yeah, I think you have to put them in the top tier, just really an incredible team throughout the season. And it didn't really slow in the playoffs. They lost one game to the Yankees in the ALDS. They lost game one to the Astros in the ALCS, and that was it. And they lost one game to the Dodgers in the World Series. So a pretty dominant and convincing postseason run. I actually put them above the Cubs and, yeah, I mean, really even above the Yankees in that regard. After the Red Sox, we have the 2019 Nationals, one of the more improbable World Series champions in recent memory. Of course, a team that I believe was 19-31 to start the season, just absolutely turned it around. Were able to do enough to get into the NL wildcard game where they hosted the Milwaukee Brewers. Of course, this is where you still had the ace and Max Scherzer and Steven Strasburg headlining this rotation. Patrick Corbin was very big for this team down the stretch as well. And then just a ton of clutch hitting throughout the lineup. But were able to get past the Brewers in an insane comeback in that NL wildcard game, kickstarted by a Juan Soto RBI single that ended up turning into more thanks to an error. And then moving on after that, they got into the NLDS, had a major upset over the Los Angeles Dodgers, who were so heavily favored and were seen to be pretty much the best team in the league throughout the regular season. They beat them in 5 games. A Howie Kendrick grand slam in game 5 in the 10th inning. Truly incredible moment for the Nationals. And then they move on to sweep the St. Louis Cardinals. And then they face the Houston Astros in an MLB first. You had the road team win every single game of this series. So certainly the opposite from what the Astros were seeing in the 2017 ALCS. The Nationals win in Houston 4 times. Really incredible for a team that without that level of postseason experience to come through and to beat a team that had made it to the ALCS a year prior and had won the World Series a year before that, to just completely neutralize them on their home field when facing the likes of Zach Greinke and Justin Verlander and Garrett Cole is truly incredible. I think really a remarkable run from this Nationals team. Now also put them kind of in that level with the 2011 Cardinals and 2012 Giants. Next up, we have the 2020 Dodgers, and I actually think this is another one that I'm not really going to go through and rank. They were 43-17 in the 60-game regular season. I'm one where I do argue that when we look at things like the NBA bubble and the NHL playoff bubble that had happened in 2020 due to the COVID pandemic, I think that the playoff format that they were able to come up with and what ended up happening ended up being, the best possible representation of what you could do to salvage that season. And I also felt like it was different because the season had stopped in March. And I mean, for the NBA and NHL, you're looking at leagues that at that point are already most of the way through your regular season. You have an idea of who's going to be making the playoffs at that point anyways. In the MLB, I think with just a 60-game sprint to the finish line in a postseason, it's tough to say how things would have played out if this was even a 100-game season. I think that 60 games over the course of a regular season feels so minuscule. I mean, you're really looking at August and September, basically. And it's no surprise that the Dodgers in their first year with Mookie Betts, were able to run through. And I think they had a great playoff run as well. I mean, they swept the Brewers in the wild card round, swept the Padres in the NLDS, came back from 3-1 against the Atlanta Braves, who looked like they had the Dodgers dead to rights, but I still think it's hard to compare them to the teams that won a World Series over a full season. So moving on from there, we have the 2021 Braves, an 88-win team that once again looked like even as late as August, it was like, how is this team thinking they're going to make the playoffs? And then sure enough, they end up getting in. And it's this upset after upset from that point on. They end up winning the National League East, which was not very strong this season. This, of course, was the final year of the singular wild card game. After 2021, you ended up moving to what we have this year in the best of 3 wild card round. But the Braves were facing a very good Milwaukee Brewers team in the NLDS that had dominated the NL Central. They lose game 1 on the road, and they respond by winning 3 in a row. Freddie Freeman with essentially a series-winning home run in game 4 of that round. And then they face the heavily favored Dodgers in the NLCS in a rematch. And, despite having so many fewer wins than this Dodgers team that had dominated all of baseball so emphatically throughout the regular season, had won 106 games and somehow still didn't win their division, it didn't matter for the Braves, who used that advantage of having the division championship. They had home field advantage because of that, and it ended up playing a huge role in this series. They got up to a 2-0 lead, and despite the Dodgers fighting back, that ended up being a 6-game victory for the Braves, and that would be the same margin that they would beat the Houston Astros by in the World Series that year. And once again, it was a deadline acquisition, looking at what Jorge Soler was able to do for that team going down the stretch, and ended up being the World Series MVP for the Braves, hitting massive home runs in games 1 and 6 of that series. just a team that proved that the regular season doesn't matter if you're able to figure it out at the right time. So, I do view this team kind of in that regard with the 2000 Yankees, 14 Giants, '06 Cardinals, of, figuring it out kind of at the right time. You had all the talent, and what you needed was already there, and they were able to pull through and win the World Series that season. After that, we had the 2022 Astros moving into the last three. This club, you can never count out the Astros. They made it to the World Series in 2021. They had made it to within a game of the World Series in 2020, despite finishing the regular season below 500. This team in 2022 was just simply not messing around. I think the way that they were able to get through the postseason just showed the amount of experience and grit and skill that this team had continued to build. I mean, this is still that same core led by Jose Altuve. Of course, this was, I feel like, a year where you really saw Yordan Alvarez and Kyle Tucker play such a significant role for this Astros team throughout the season and down the stretch. And of course, a really good World Series against the Philadelphia Phillies, too. And the Astros had to prove that they were there for it. I mean, came back from that 2-1 deficit, and of course threw a combined no-hitter in this series as well. So really incredible there, and that's on the heels of sweeping the Yankees in that year's ALCS, which was certainly a very decisive performance there. So I think this Astros team was just really solid. They were one of the best teams in baseball throughout the season. I don't think it surprised anybody that they were able to close down business against a Phillies team that had surprised a lot of people by getting into the playoffs, let alone making it all the way to the World Series. So I'll put this Astros team up here with like the Marlins and Diamondbacks. Really a solid team, but I don't think quite stands out among the best of the best. Next up, we have the Rangers in 2023. I think similar to the '05 White Sox, if we're talking about just full-blown impressive runs, this has to rank very high when you're looking at how dominant this team was on the road. I mean, you got through the Tampa Bay Rays in that wild card series, winning both games on the road, won both games against the Baltimore Orioles, who had won over 100 in the ALDS. And then the Astros end up falling victim to the same thing they did in the 2019 World Series, where the road team wins every game of the series, and the Astros were the ones with home field advantage. So the Rangers win in Houston 4 times and then really put on a show in the World Series. They split the first 2 in Texas, and then against the 84-win Diamondbacks, win all 3 in Arizona to close it out. I think the Astros were, of course, the most significant challenge in this postseason. The Orioles did win 100 games, but still that was a very playoff inexperienced team. And this is a Rangers team that, while as the Rangers were quite inexperienced, you had a lot of experience in the clubhouse and on the roster. Guys like Marcus Semien and Corey Seager, who were huge to the Rangers in this playoff run, had both had experience on playoff runs prior to this as well. So I definitely think that helped this club being what they were. And this is a really good team that I think had such an impressive run with how you could not beat them on the road. I mean, we just don't see that in the playoffs hardly ever, and this team was able to figure it out. So I'll actually put them right there. I would say above the D-backs and the White Sox in that regard. And then finally, we have the Dodgers of last year. I feel like this was not a surprise to anybody. They added Shohei Ohtani. They won the World Series in the first year after they got him. It felt a lot like when the Golden State Warriors added Kevin Durant to an extent. It was, I feel like, one of the more inevitable and predictable feeling championships, but you have to give the Dodgers a lot of credit for how this all turned out. Of course, they were dominant in the World Series. They were able to get past the Mets in 6 games in the NLCS. But look back at that NLDS. I mean, this was a team that is trailing 2-1 to the division rival Padres, and they had to win a game in San Diego, and they ended up shutting down the Padres for, I believe, the last 24 innings of that series, or maybe it was even more than that. Truly incredible performance from the Dodgers pitching staff in that series and throughout the postseason. And once again, this was a team that just did not have a discernible weakness. So made it really hard to see how you were going to get past a team like the 2024 Dodgers. So I'll also put them, up in this top tier with the Cubs of 2016, 18 Red Sox, '09 Yankees, and the '04 Red Sox. But that is all I have for today. There is my ranking of the 2000 to 2024 World Series champions on a tier list. I'll have this video up and you could see where else to follow up on my content in the description. I'll be posting this as a post on the therubbermatch.blog where you could also see the final image from the tier list as well. But we got plenty of more MLB postseason action still left in October, and soon there will be another champion to factor into a tier list like this. But thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you later.